The treatment uses visual elements to accentuate the idea or the concept that you want to portray in your film. Sometimes you can use what is in front of your camera, with what type of movements you are going to do with the camera. You can do different things in post-production. Today I'm going to talk about different samples of films when we use different elements to experiment with the visuals. Perspective. For this film, the concept was actually inspired by the interview that I had with different models, and when you would ask them what was the first thing that impressed you about New York, and almost 80% said the tall buildings. The element that we focused on this treatment was the point of view of the camera. We decided to use the camera in very extreme angles, like very low or very high, to create a feeling of a giant. Compared with the buildings, he was really a short person with also a wide angle lens, which accentuates more the angle of perspective. We use some perspective of lines to create different sequences. You see them very small and then very close to the camera when he looks large. And the character at the end find a key, which is a very little key. That represented that finally you find yourself. On Infinity, we use a different language. It was a code story. We were inspired almost by this Mission Impossible, that kind of a spy vibe. The idea was that every time one model would cross the other one, there was a piece of paper that was passed from one to the other. So the whole time you see that they are finding a piece of paper, which is a code that is coming from one to the other. So the camera is following one and then follows the other, and every time they cross, they don't even talk, they don't look at each other, but then you see that the paper is suddenly in their pockets. And that was the story, and then we decided how are we going to make it fluid. At that point, I had done a lot of camera on tripod and movements, but always on tripod. So for this project, I worked with Glenn Johnson. We decided that we wanted to have the film from beginning to end in a non-stop camera movement. And we call it Infinity because the movement of the camera was in this shape. So every time the models would come, the camera had to cross to the other to see the one that was behind, and that's when we came with this idea of movement. I think it was really incredible that we didn't have to stop, even on the long shot that we were all running. And because the camera was going around and around, the whole team had to run behind the camera because we couldn't see the people behind the scenes. And that was really something very special. So you can play with your camera, like with the way you put the camera. You can play with movements, with the way or you can decide what is going to be in front of your camera, creating something that has a specific movement, and you can create something almost poetic. And for the deals, I was working in something a little bit different. I had this beautiful couple, and I wanted to represent the love that I had for each other, and how they miss each other. So to express emotion or feelings, I had both models do the same actions, one after the other. They would touch the shoulder, Sven would touch the shoulder, and then Brigitte would do the same. And then with editing, it was almost like a movement, like a choreography, and we wrote down each movement in advance. Their movements were continuous. Also, I used black and white, in this case, with very soft light, mostly natural light. The black and white and the soft focus help the images to be very pure and very dynamic with angles. Even though they are wearing almost no clothes, it has a very soft, non-sexual feeling. Also in front of the camera, I had the two models almost have the same hair texture. Also use music to emphasize, and we use an acoustic piece on guitar. I wanted everything to be very, very, very subtle and very delicate. One of my favorites. So you can create your own elements as well, and you can create your own language. Sometimes it's good that people notice it. I think if it's well done, it's in the right balance. You can use also elements in post, the way you edit in The forest, I work with a co-directed with Gabriel Peña, and then we decided to have the frame cut in two halves. And I also, in the edit, we kind of overlap the halves. Wanted to create this dynamic of these two characters that try to communicate, but they are separated. So we created a space for each one. They overlap. We created an overlapping graphic. So it's not two different scenes, it's more like the same scene that is cut, but they are always on their end. And what we wanted to create is that separation of the two characters through the story. You can actually see two stories happening in the two squares. So if you would see just one side, you would see one of the character, but the other actor was on the other side as well. And we came with that idea after we shot it. This little line worked really well, and at the end there is a connection, and then you have to see the film. Like, you can see all the films on the links below.